Hey, everybody, this is Alex and Ben. Welcome back to another episode of The Oregon Bridge.
What's harmful to our democracy is when you have a governor who can do emergency executive orders for over a year without having to present any kind of scientific evidence as to why. Where is the role of a governor and executive authority, and where is the role of local governments and communities to really govern themselves? So that's what I really focus on in our campaign, is empowering the local communities. That's how we need to face these issues, is face the big issues facing us as a people head on and making sure that we're lifting everybody when we do it.
Hey, everybody. Thanks again for listening. Today, we're excited to bring you Mayor Stan Pulliam. And Mayor Stan, not Mayor Pulliam, as you'll prescribe. I thought that was the best nickname for him during the podcast. He's the mayor of Sandy, Oregon, which is one of the fastest growing towns in Oregon. He's also an insurance executive. And most famously, he has pushed back against Governor Kate Brown's lockdowns across the state. He's got a bunch of national attention for that. He's also an insurance executive, and he is also exploring a run for governor. So we will see if he actually formally decides to put his name into the ring, but he's at least exploring it pretty seriously right now. And I wouldn't be shocked at all to see if he actually did come on full time and went into the race. But Ben, what did you think of Mayor Stan?
First of all, exploratory in name only. The man is running for governor. It's happening. Just wait for it. I thought it was a great interview. I thought it was one of our most interesting back and forth sort of interviews. You know, usually our tone here is conversational and we hear people out, but I challenged the mayor on a couple issues, and I thought his answers in response and our back and forth was really interesting. And I think it will show listeners the sort of differences in where folks are coming from. For example, I think the most interesting back and forth was on sanctuary counties, and this idea of like there's some Oregon counties that they're calling sanctuary counties for gun laws, where they just say we're not going to follow the state law here. And he compared that to sanctuary cities for undocumented immigrants. So I think the conversation there was interesting. I also thought his question on education was revealing. So basically, those of you who've been following the COVID-19 situation in Oregon, you know that Mayor Pulliam is sort of one of the leaders calling for schools to be reopened immediately. We need full 5-day in person, and has been calling for this for a long time. And I basically asked him, you know, assuming we're back in person full time in the fall, 5 days a week, what are your education priorities as governor? Given that the governor is the superintendent of public instruction, basically the chief schools officer in the state. And his answer was like, that shouldn't be my job. That shouldn't be part of the governor's portfolio, which I also thought was interesting. So yeah, fascinating conversation. And at the end, we talk a little bit about race and racial disparities in Oregon. And I think it just shows how many light years Democrats are apart from Republicans in terms of how we think about these issues. So an interesting interview. And I really just can't wait to see the Republican field for governor kind of be solidified, because I do think that Mayor Pulliam has a real shot at becoming the nominee.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'd heard of Mayor Stan just kind of through different Republican conservative circles, but I was very impressed by the interview, and it would not surprise me at all if he was the candidate who came ahead in the primary. And one thing I think that he actually did on our interview, and clearly he's comfortable with doing, is that he isn't afraid of saying that he's pro-life when it comes to abortion. As if some of our listeners may have seen the recent piece that I wrote criticizing Senator Packwood and his approach to some of the social issues. But I think it is essentially not impossible, I'll say, but very difficult for a Republican to brag about being how pro-choice they are and how socially liberal they are, because you will never out socially liberal the Democrats. And as we saw with Newt Buehler, they still attacked him for, quote, aligning with Donald Trump's pro-life agenda, even though I don't think anyone thinks Dr. Buehler was a threat to abortion rights in the state of Oregon. But that's politics for you. But I was very impressed by Mayor Stan. I also think he brings some nice energy. Like, he's clearly a very outgoing guy. He gets really excited about this stuff. Like, I think that's
flipped.
Good.
He flipped really quick though. He went from like very like calm, funny, nice to like my first question. He like came back at me really hard, which was hilarious and also like good for him.
Yeah, no, it was really good. And I thought that was definitely one of the best interviews that we've done so far. And also just a pretty fun one to kind of listen to the back and forth between you guys. And he had some interesting thoughts on homelessness too. I forgot. He had like kind of a 3-section check mark of like, it flowed really well, whatever the language was. I forgot exactly what it was, but the viewers will hear it throughout the podcast. But very impressive. I consider him to be, if not the top tier candidate, definitely the top of the list. So we'll just have to continue to see what happens there. But Ben, any closing thoughts before the episode?
I hope everyone enjoys this episode. I also want to give a plug. We won't say who yet, but Alex and I landed a very big interview that will be coming out after this episode. So if you're not subscribed yet, make sure you're subscribed on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you're listening. We got a pretty big get for an interview that I'm really excited about. So stay tuned for future guests. We've already got, I think, 2 or 3 interviews scheduled, and things are really coming together. So we're pretty excited.
Yep. Very, very excited to be able to roll those out. So yeah, thanks again. And just make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you can give us 5 stars, that'd be great. I see the 5-star ratings is still coming in, but really excited to bring you guys a lot more cool content. So we'll see you in the episode. All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Oregon Bridge podcast. Today, we're really excited to have Mayor Stan Pulliam, who's the mayor of Sandy, on the podcast. And Mayor, how are you doing today?
We're great. Well, we're in Sandy, right? Everything is Sandy. The sky's a little bluer, it's a little warmer. It's perfect here. We're doing great today. How are you?
Good. And yeah, it's rainy and sort of depressing here as it just kind of is generally in the Portland area. So we're just another day in normal. And Mayor, I do have to ask you, do you go by Mayor Stan or do you go by Mayor Pulliam?
Stan. Mayor Stan.
Okay. I like Mayor Stan. It kind of reminds me of Mayor Pete.
Mayor Pete.
I'm not a fan at all of Mayor Pete. I literally wish any other candidate in the primary would have won besides Mayor Pete. So I was happy that Joe Biden won and Mayor Pete did not. But I do like Mayor Stan a lot. So I'm glad that you do.
Can I just clarify that it's Secretary Pete now and not Mayor Pete? So show some respect on
Right.
He's always Mayor Pete.
Mayors are better. Mayor, come on. What's your mayor? That's about as good as it gets now, Ben. Let's get that right.
Awesome. So Mayor Stan, thanks again for coming on the podcast. We'd just love to hear, normally as we start off with our guests, just a little bit more about your background and what made you want to get involved in politics. Give us the full rundown there.
Yeah. So, I'm one of those fortunate, lucky souls that get to be mayor of my hometown, right? Which is pretty cool. I grew up here in Sandy. Sandy's one of these smaller communities right outside the Portland metro area, 25 miles outside of Portland. And, it's the kind of place that you still go to the store and you run into 1 or 2 people that and you have a conversation with, and your T-ball and gymnastic teams and stuff are all sponsored by your local Main Street communities. And you walk into the restaurant, you talk to the owner. A lot of time I had either grown up with them or their spouse is somebody I was a former classmate of mine, or, maybe it's somebody that's even a kid these days is somebody I went to school with. So it's one of those communities that where we have a lot less of those kind of communities, but Sandy's are a really special place. And you think of us right there on Highway 26. I like to say we're kind of the gateway to everything just fun in Oregon, of Mount Hood recreation and Central Oregon and all those kinds of things. And so I grew up as in a house of a trucker, small business owners. My parents, my dad used to work 2 jobs driving truck, and they dreamed big and started their own small transportation business. And so, I grew up in a house watching them just grind, and fight for that business. And you think about some of the policy positions I've taken over the last year and a half and standing up for our community. I think a lot of it is roots of that, when I walk in, I talk to our business owners and I know them, I grew up with them, but I look at them in their eyes and I see Tony and Sue Pulliam, my mom and dad, who just, really fought for that business to give us kids opportunities that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And so being mayor, it's been a pretty crazy couple of years to kind of jump into doing something like this. And my wife, Mackenzie, and I were kind of right at that spot, I think, that have been most impacted on these lockdowns. Being mayor of a community very dependent on our main street, having 2 young kids in elementary school, and feeling the ramifications of these shutdowns. And we're both working parents, right? We're a middle class family living in kind of suburban Oregon. I like to say we're middle class with middle class problems and middle class debt, and so you think about some of the things affecting us with these lockdowns coming out. It just really is lit a fire under me because we're really feeling the ramifications of that. And I think that there's a better way to lead, and that's kind of what's really forced us to jump in and take a strong look at this. We caught a bit of a wave, with standing up to the governor on some of this, and so now we're doing our due diligence to kind of see where this wave takes us.
Yeah, and so I do want to talk a little bit more about your time as mayor.
Yeah.
And one thing in particular, so Sandy obviously is not as big as Portland, but is still a big city. From my understanding, it's also growing. It's not like there's 700 people in the town, like it is a bigger city.
Yeah.
Republicans throughout over the past 30 years actually used to do very well in cities. We used to have a lot of mayorships. Of course, for a long time, Republicans even controlled the mayorship in large cities like a New York. Over the past just decade or two, that has dramatically changed. I believe that the only sort of major city Republican mayor is the mayor of San Diego, and I actually don't even know if he's still there anymore.
No,
Really have to check on
former
that.
mayor. He's running for governor now.
Okay, yeah, so he's
Good
running for governor.
platform.
So
Yeah.
yeah, hopefully he'll take the step up. But I'm just sort of curious from your perspective as a Republican who is a mayor in a growing and a bigger city, what's sort of the missing sauce across the country? Like, why aren't we doing well in urban areas anymore? What are some strategies that you've seen effective? I know, of course, that basically, from my understanding, your office was not partisan when you ran, but I imagine that a lot of people did know you were associated with the Republican Party.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of curious, what's that sauce that we used to have, but that we're missing from your perspective?
Yeah, I think as well as quite frankly, it's the same sauce we had as Republicans in Oregon, which is developing, real pragmatic, common sense solutions to the problems in front of us. And I think too often as Republicans, we don't offer up a vision, of our policy platform and our vision for our communities and our states. And we get tied in the national issues and some of these big picture things. But you think about the issues that face communities like mine and Sandy, one is growth and the style in which we want to grow and kind of the culture and the traditions and fabric of our community that's really important and holding on to those things. It's, economic development and making sure that we have, family wage jobs so that people can work, live, and play, in our community. It's I talk a lot about transportation being a family values issue. If you have, 60% of our community in Sandy's in the commuter shed going to Portland. And so if we're sitting 45 minutes, an hour and a half in traffic, you're not coaching that after school sport, you're not, volunteering for your local nonprofit organizations. Safety, we talk a lot about the defund the police and the different police reforms things, but, safety is incredibly important, especially in suburban communities, in these local communities with these young families. We need to concentrate on that. Little things like, transit and the ability to have access to proper transit in your community and having a walkable downtown core and tourism and recreation and parks and things for people to do. I think we miss out on these livability issues, where, and that was kind of our secret sauce. Tip O'Neill used to always say that, all politics is local. And when I ran for mayor, we talked about local mayor issues and the problems facing our community and our kind of our common sense and pragmatic, approach to solving these problems. And now we're looking at running for governor, and you don't see me talking a lot about national issues. We're talking about issues that are facing us here in Oregon and what are some reasonable, pragmatic, solutions to those problems. So I think that's the secret sauce, is returning to local, addressing these problems, not being afraid to address these problems, and just coming up with these answers, these solutions that aren't Republican or Democrat, right? But are ones that really have a chance to bring your community together to address them.
That's a perfect transition to what I wanted to ask you about in this section, which is like, in when we recorded the intro of the first episode, I think Alex cited Tip O'Neill's quote about all politics is local. And our thesis is basically that that's dead, that the era of all politics is local is over. Because as you know, if you make it to the general election, you can have all the ideas and position papers on transportation and, the sort of nonpartisan issues, but your position on abortion and LGBT rights and race and like the sort of hot button social issues of the moment, those are going to be what people want to talk about, particularly in the urban centers. So I guess that's what I'm curious about, how you think about that. Do you identify as a social conservative, or do you think like that's not something that you want to be part of the campaign necessarily? And how do you balance the primary side versus the general election side?
So as far as being a social conservative or not, I'm a Stan conservative. I'm pro-life. I've always been strongly pro-life, but at the same time, here in a rural community in Sandy, my senior year in high school, we had a mock Congress, like some communities do, and mine was legalizing same-sex marriage, right, in rural Sandy, Oregon, back in the late 90s. So I mean, I'm a Stan conservative, and I think that I match up a lot, quite frankly, with conservatives kind of in my age group in the way that we view some of those issues. And I think, obviously people like to talk about some of those larger social issues, and those are really important issues, and people deserve to have, candidates answers to that. But you think about, I'm on a podcast with you guys today, and one thing I've noticed is that these podcasts are starting to pop up, all over the state, and they're getting a lot of play in these local community pages on social media and these different things. And so I agree that, especially over the last 4 years with a Trump presidency, we've gotten a lot of kind of this vacuum suck into these Washington, D.C., politics. But I think we have an opportunity if we do it right. If we get involved in these local communities, we're on a listening tour going to these different communities across the state. We're joining in on podcasts. I'm on the Backwoods Brothers in Estacada. I'm going on that. And so I think there is an opportunity to focus on some of this local stuff. As a mayor, that feels very natural to me. I'll tell you, it's been a crazy 2 years, especially the last year and a half. And when I think about how we have faced some of these issues, we've got Republicans and, we're all nonpartisan, but you got registered Republicans and Democrats in our city council. You got parents, you got grandparents, people all over the spectrum. And I remember when this COVID stuff came out, I was really vocal about it. And some of our counselors were like, whoa, man, Mayor, you're out front here, brother. You're out front. And, so what happened is we had a community dialogue about it. Rhea from Sandy Family Restaurant came and talked to our council. We had Paul and Lila Reed from Mount Hood Athletic Club, Denise from Payless Pizza. And it was like, oh, wow, these are people. We had a community conversation. We had a conversation as neighbors. And when we voted on the letter to go to the governor, it was 7-0, right? And the letter was the letter we all compromised and came together on. And I just think that with how divided we are nationally and even as a state, this is an opportunity to return these issues locally to local municipalities where people are making these decisions as neighbors, and same in our school system with empowering local school boards. And, this listening to a lot of what I hear of is people say, you get into critical race theory and, sex education, all this stuff going on in schools. And people say, Stan, I just want the ability to opt in or out. Right? Like, I just want the individual ability to decide for me and my family and my kids, or we're going to opt into these things or opt out of them. And so that's what I really focus on in our campaign is empowering local communities, empowering individuals. And I think this is the time for it. Unprecedented lockdowns, people, stomping all over individual rights and liberties. I think it's a fresh outlook and stuff that will really resonate with people.
Yeah. So getting in a little bit to the lockdowns, and I know we'll talk about this in a bit as well, but so you were actually mentioned in a New York Times article. I think it's called 100 Days in Chaos or Oregon.
And I don't, by the way, that never gets old, but people are like, Mayor, recently in the New York Times. It's just like, how cool is that?
Yeah. So, and that's one thing I think really goes back to our thesis is this nationalization of politics.
Yeah.
In the sense of that, what was the experience like for you? Again, Sandy is not a small town. It's not a blip on the map, but I mean, I doubt most people in New York City know, or Washington, D.C. know where Sandy, Oregon is,
right.
Unless you're from Oregon. What was it like to, I think that your decision was, I don't want to call it dramatic, but it was a big step basically to say, we're going to ignore these lockdowns. We're going to focus on local issues. I'm going to take leadership basically on this. And the New York Times, of course, felt that it was sort of a big enough story to be able to cover. I mean, What was that like for you to basically gain national media attention for? And maybe, everyone's a politician. Maybe you were trying to gain some media attention for it. Maybe you weren't, but I'm sure you were maybe a little bit shocked when the New York Times decided that they should cover you for this.
Yeah.
What was that experience like? And I mean, I'm curious, like, were people in Sandy, your friends and family, like, whoa, Stan, like, why is the New York Times writing about this? Like, this is a big decision, but like, is this really a national issue for the national discourse of what's going on in Sandy, Oregon? Like, what was that experience like? What were people talking about to you? Really curious about that.
Yeah, so what's funny about it is, and we were talking earlier, is that Mayor Stan or Mayor Pulliam and then Mayor Pete is, I just got done reading one of Mayor Pete's books about him being mayor. And I bring this up to say, so at the end of it, he talks about he was running for chair of the DNC at the time. And he goes back in his whole career, people talk about his ambition. It's just a stepping stone. And he goes, one thing that was funny is after making national media, people never asked me about stepping stone and stuff anymore in North Bend. They were proud. They felt like our community was represented on a national level. And that's really was kind of the response here in Sandy is we have a bit of a swagger to our step, quite honestly, where, we feel like we've kind of linked in together and really stood up for ourselves and our local community, with some of the shutdowns that are happening. We stood up with our neighbors. And so it's been unreal, for the New York Times to reach out, to get Fox News appearances and those kinds of things. It's something that we'd certainly never planned on, but it really started to give us a lot of community pride, and I got in the car during that New Year's Day movement. We were driving around these different communities and doing these rallies. And I can't even explain when, you're the mayor of an 11,000 community, Sandy, Oregon, and you drive a couple hours away and there's several hundred cars, waiting for you, and in a rally of several hundred people that know who you are. Or we got into a car the other day, we were in Madras and we had lunch at a local Mexican restaurant. And, we got the masks on and I got a backwards hat going and the cook comes out and goes, I know who you are, I recognize you, and shakes my hand. And those this last holiday season, we had people leaving cookies and stuff, different neighbors with these incredible notes. And those are things that hadn't happened, in our public service yet. That's just been a pretty incredible feeling. And we're proud. I think a lot of us are proud of what we've done over the last year and a half to stand up for our local community and to really push back against the governor's lockdowns. You mentioned people in New York may have never heard of Sandy before. And, I think a lot of us out here, we're proud of our internet, believe it or not. We kind of led the world in high-speed broadband internet, SandyNet. We have over 80% of our people that live here actually log on and use SandyNet as their internet provider. So we already kind of have that in the fabric of what we do. We're kind of innovative and do things out here, and so it's been pretty cool. It's been a pretty cool experience.
That you've mentioned a couple of times, so I feel like we got to just jump into the issue of the lockdowns and your response and how that has sort of springboarded your campaign. Sure. And I think you're the first Republican, first candidate of either party, I think, to announce an exploratory committee. So one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently, and I've talked to Alex about this, is you've probably seen, so the legislature in previous sessions has passed gun safety measures, gun control measures that rural counties, conservative counties don't like. And in some of those counties, they call themselves sanctuary counties, where basically they say, we're not enforcing that law here. And in some ways, that's sort of what your approach has been with the lockdown measures. They're not laws, but they do have the force of law by being from the governor's office, which you would have in an emergency situation were you to be elected governor. And so what I've been thinking about isn't that troubling for our democracy? If, so it's troubling for me with obviously Democrats in control because, those are things that I agree with, but I imagine it would be troubling for you if you were governor and passed a piece of legislation and then Multnomah and Washington and Marion County all said, well, we're not going to enforce that law here, or ignored your executive order on some other issue. So how do you balance that kind of issue?
So I'll push back a little bit, to be honest with you. So you used the word democracy, and then you said passed, and then you used, order, right? And so where I would go there is I would say, what's harmful to our democracy is when you have a governor who can do emergency executive orders for over a year without having to present any kind of scientific evidence as to why, you're placing these orders into effect. And it's even more, frustrating when you watch our state representatives and state senators not even represent our communities, and be called into the legislature. They're obviously in a long session now, but most of these lockdowns were before that session was in order. Where are these folks? Why are they not being called into a special session? At the very least, they should be ratifying these emergency orders. And, we're in super majorities here of Democrats, same party as Governor Kate Brown. So they should have been able to do that. She has the votes to do that. But what they don't have is the backbone to do it, right? And so instead of passing things, they just do it through executive, fiat and orders. And so that to me is what's really troubling about, our democracy with where we're at now. I get the sanctuary thing. It's funny. I was just in Central Oregon over this last year, after this last weekend, and I'd get the question, so where are you on sanctuaries? And I said, well, when are you asking me? Are you asking me when conservatives were upset about sanctuaries because of immigration laws? Or are you asking me now because we're, trying to do our own sanctuaries for the Second Amendment? How about we're just consistent, right? Republican, Democrat, let's just be consistent. I'm against sanctuaries, right? I believe that our Second Amendment rights a lot of the time should be a federal issue. It's our federal constitution. That's where we should be taking up those issues a lot of the time. Our immigration laws is a federal issue. It's a federal issue. And so if we want to invoke change there, we need to elect congressmen and senators that represent us at a national level to change those laws. But the idea that we're going to start looking at things and saying, even though it's federal jurisdiction, to say, you know what, we're just not going to follow it here, at the state level, I'm against that. And, some of the reporting that has happened about because I could see, Ben, where you would want to come back and say, but Mayor, you yourself, wanted to open up against the stuff. And where I would say we are different, one is Sandy never closed. Okay. So there was never a reason for us to open up. That was a state shutdown. And so there was no, it's funny for all the reports about Sandy opening. We weren't opening. We were just supporting our local small business owners in their right to open if they decided to, And what we were doing is we were advocating, saying, if you decide to open, we're going to stand with you. We're going to raise money to help you with your fines. We're going to plug you into legal resources and that kind of a thing. So I apologize. I can go off on tangents.
No. I appreciate the dialogue, but now I have to push back on your pushback.
Yes. Okay, good.
So you basically said that you don't think that the governor should have been able to have that extended executive authority. But my pushback would be, but she does. That is part of her power. Sure. And in our series of checks and balances as a government, the legislature does have the authority to curtail that executive power. They have not chosen to do so. You can be upset with the legislature for not doing that, but that's something that they didn't do. And we have the court system, which has never since the lockdown said the governor's executive order expires. And so what in effect has happened is you have, local leaders such as yourself who are sort of choosing not to follow the law, sure. Which is, contrary to what I would tease Titus with, which is, I thought Republicans were the party of rule of law. So why aren't we following the law?
But Ben, I thought your party was the party of civil disobedience. No? Right. And so I just find
but part of civil disobedience is owning the consequences of your actions.
Is it? Oh, really? Really? After what we've seen happening in Multnomah County with riots on the street every single night, with the district attorney of Multnomah County that is essentially legalized violent crime, capturing these guys one day, putting them back on the street the other. All of a sudden, we're going to hold people, you want to know the only people being held responsible for the consequences of their actions is people like Melissa Adams out at Spud Monkey, in Gresham, who has had a horrific year. She's lost her husband. Her son committed suicide over the past year. She's lost one of her restaurants. She's down to the one at Spud Monkeys. She's had a press conference with us earlier in the week. They've opened up against the mandate. Yesterday, 2 days ago, Multnomah County Health shows up at her front door to be able to put inspections down on her and to fine her business. Think about this. This in Multnomah County, where we have mass homelessness on the streets, breaking all of our camping rules and everything else. We got riots going on downtown. We have skyrocketing, gun violence and everything else going on. But they got time for Melissa Adams at Spud Monkeys to come down there.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and no doubt that there have been tremendous personal consequences and suffering for a lot of people over the last year. But to me, and to me, all those things you cited are sort of separate issues from the issue of do we have a system of governance that we all respect and participate in, or do we allow our feelings about these other things?
Totally.
So let me just put it to you this way: if you're governor and you sign an executive order, which there are non-emergency executive orders that governors often sign, what would your response be if Multnomah County said, we're not going to enforce that here? That doesn't play here.
Well, I mean, it honestly, to me, in a lot of ways, depends on the executive order. I mean,
Okay.
and I only say that meaning, I mean, there are executive orders, I think that we've seen, that I'll say that I've seen both in President Trump's administration and President Biden's administration, and with Governor Brown, as we just talked about, that are far overreaching, executive orders. These executive orders are supposed to be guidance based, right? So, I mean, it's a hypothetical. I think of any political strategist, right, would tell me, you never answer a hypothetical question. But I will tell you where I struggle with executive orders is I going back to our earlier conversation of local control and stepping on others' authority. As I get questions all the time about like Ron DeSantis. I'm a big fan of Ron DeSantis, but he's done a few executive orders that really do kind of trample on local authority a little bit, and so that is kind of the inner battle that I have with myself a lot. Is where is the role of a governor and executive authority, and where is the role of local governments and communities to really govern themselves? So what I'd like my answer to that, Ben, and it's a total weak answer, you're not going to like it. But my answer to that is that I believe I would never have an executive order that's so outrageous, that it's not going to be abided by. But maybe that's just wishful thinking.
No, I appreciate the dialogue there, Mayor.
Yeah. And I mean, that is kind of the beauty of democracy in a way, right? Is like, I mean, for example, like weed legalization in Oregon, when it first came out, I mean, technically under the Trump administration, I'm assuming that the feds could have came in and just started arresting people left and right, maybe even some state legislatures and things like that. Obviously, I think that they saw that probably as maybe not a step over their authority, but just something that they weren't going to do. So, I mean, that is kind of
working together. That's what really bothered me about the whole like Trump, I'm going to send the federal marshals in, and Biden saying they're not allowed. And I mean, to me, we've got a problem in Portland. Right. And so the mayor should then step up and go to the president. I don't care who the president is, if it's Biden or Trump, and say, we need help. Right. And this is the kind of help that we need, whether it's federal marshals or deputizing our state police as, federal marshals to get them in a district court, whatever it might be. So that is part of, I think, what is troublesome is we have this party fighting stuff when we really need to be putting that stuff to the side and have conversations like what we're having today.
Yeah, and so actually that's the topic we wanted to address with you as well, is homelessness. And actually, I had read your piece on the Oregon Way Substack. Shout out to Kevin Frazier, who was also on our podcast a couple weeks ago. Yeah. But one thing that actually shocked me a little bit about it was just how in depth actually some of your solutions were to the issue, especially for someone who's considering running for higher office, because with most of this stuff, it's just kind of a couple bullet points that are like, this is bad and this is good. But it was actually, you talk through your, I'd recommend that people go and check out the piece, because it actually was, no matter if you're to the left or to the right, I think that they would enjoy reading it. But I mean, just from growing up in the Portland area, at least from, I don't know about the numbers exactly, I'm assuming they've probably increased, but sort of the visibility of homelessness has become astounding. I mean, honestly, even driving from my residence to the airport, it's like you see all these tents on the highway, there's all this trash on the highway, and they seem to just continuously grow basically by the years. So we're hoping we could talk about that issue with you, but kind of from your perspective as a mayor. And actually one thing you pointed out, which I thought was interesting, is that 40% of the homeless population used to just be located basically in the Portland metropolitan area, but they've actually sort of spread basically throughout the state now. And they're kind of, I'm assuming the numbers have increased in Portland, but there's just more people and they're in more places. So
think about that, Alex. I mean, sorry to interrupt, but think about that for a second, right? 40% of the homelessness used to be concentrated in downtown Portland just 10 years ago. And now only 20% of homelessness is concentrated in the downtown core. And yet, think about how much worse that problem has gotten in the downtown core over the last 10 years. So that just starts to give you just a little flavor of the issue of it growing out of Portland, sure, but as the issue continues to grow in Portland itself. So it's just blowing up, the homelessness issue here.
Yeah, exactly. And I know that when we had Minority Leader Drazen on before too, she said that Oregon actually has something along the lines of like the worst or least amount of available resources for youth homelessness in particular too. So I'm curious, if you were governor, what would be your sort of broad approach to the homeless issue, and what does it kind of look like?
Yeah, so it's kind of a three-pronged approach. It's very similar to the old Mayor Bud Clark, which everybody should go to Goose Hollow, to his place here in Portland. My daughter Lucy and I, it's her favorite spot. But the three-pronged approach really is to help those who want it, be firm with those who don't, and help create a safe environment for neighbors and everybody to feel, and restaurants and businesses to feel safe in. And a lot of the time people talk about this Ninth Circuit course decision out of Boise that says, you need to provide alternative land and inventory for a homeless if you're going to move that homeless camp along. And people really say that hamstrings people. And I refuse to be one of those that feel hamstrung. And Cascade Policy Institute, local nonpartisan think tank kind of in the Portland area, did a white paper.
My mother actually works there.
Is that right? Oh, I didn't
Yeah.
even know that. Yeah. So Eric Fruit's there, and at Cascade Policy Institute about 2 or 3 months ago did a white paper that didn't get much attention that really talked about the kind of history of homelessness in the Portland region and stuff, and offered some really common sense, sensible solutions. Stuff like tracking the vacancy rate. We have all of this housing that's available. We have the Metro housing bond that passed. We have all these great nonprofits. We have local governments that take over these hotels and stuff. But what we never do is track the vacancy rate. So, the city of Modesto, every morning they call around and they track the vacancy. And then they give their officers at a meeting that morning, the resources they need. So when they come across a homeless camp, they say, hey, here's your alternative housing. Now you need to move along. And we're in, tech capital USA. There is no reason that we can't develop an app, that's at the fingertips of police officers, where they say, here's the vacancy, here's your available housing. And we have places like the Expo Center and the old horse track that, has acres and acres of property where we can help house people and move them into, and then plug them into resources that bring them out of homelessness. I recently had a meeting with Homer Williams, who worked with Jordan Snitzer on the Wapato project in the Portland area. And they've come up with very innovative housing solutions that, you see these kind of wheeler villas all over Portland. And what Homer's talking about doing is something way better that actually has running water and sewer and access to food and resources. And the only rule is you got to follow the rules, right? But what he can't find right now is anyone in state or local government, that actually have the backbone to stand up and show the leadership to, support something like that. I think we need to triple the size of the state police, and get it back to about the size, that where they were. We were talking about, the riots and all that, but these are folks that are manning a lot of the recreational trails that we have around the area, and doing the hunting and fishing licenses and all those kinds of things. We got to get them stronger. And then
Can I clarifying question? How would the state police interact with the homelessness problem?
Well, one is you would get more police officers on the streets. And so like when they're on the front lines and they get a call and there's a homeless encampment along a sidewalk, they have the vacancy rate, right? They have that app on their phone that I was talking about, but you need more of them to invoke to those folks. You also need some of those folks that are working with nonprofits and different agencies to clean up the garbage and to help clean up, a lot of these camps. So, and then, yeah, go ahead.
So the 3 points you had was help those who want it, be firm with those who don't. And what was the third point?
Help people in the community feel safe.
Okay. So I think there's something missing from that I want to hear you weigh in on, which is the sort of front end problem. Like homelessness is growing, and it feels to me that a lot of what we talk about when we talk about addressing homelessness is about the symptom, but not the underlying problems, which is an economic system that leaves people behind, a behavioral health system that's severely underfunded, an addiction crisis that is out of control in our state.
Right.
And so do you have thoughts on this sort of broader, like these structural big systems wide issue that a governor is uniquely situated, I would say, to bring us together to solve? How would you go about the sort of structural problems that are feeding into what shows up as a homelessness problem in our cities?
Well, what I would say there is the housing first initiatives that have been coming out of, the legislature in these different areas have been proven not to work, right? They're living in this imaginary world that's like the individual that's walking down the street suffering from a mental health crisis, that's self-medicating with heroin and living in a tent in an abandoned parking lot. They're just an affordable home away from their life, like being put back on track and being normal. And that's not true, right? That is not true. What's true is that we need to get into preventative services. We've got to, help out the mental health issues that are going around. We need full wraparound services. It's more government, quite frankly, that comes into that, but it's also propping up our local nonprofits and faith communities to be able to get involved in that. But, one thing, you hear some of my, my practical ideas that I'm introducing there. That's because, I understand prevention, but we got a problem now.
It's got to be both.
It's got to be both, right? It's got to be prevention, but it's also got to be addressing the issues that we have right now. But that's why where you're sending these folks, when you're taking that camp and you're, taking it out of your downtown core and into an area, you've got to be able to plug those individuals into services where they can get help. But I'll tell you, the one thing I did really learn, Ben, on that hike that Alex is talking about from the, the column that I wrote recently is that, as I was talking to the woman that I referenced in that article, the one thing that came really apparent is that they want their own individuality. You're right. They want their own liberty and their own freedoms. A lot of the things that we've talked about earlier. And so finding a way where you're balancing, people need to follow a certain set of rules and they need to be plugged into things that help bring them out of homelessness. But we've got to find ways to balance that with their own private space, their own individuality, and all those kinds of things as well.
For sure. I appreciate your thinking there.
It's a hard issue, but I'll tell you, I'm trying to find answers, right? And that's the one thing that does bother me about these things is so many times, and whether you like the answers or not, that's fine. Let's debate those things, right? Let's have a conversation about it. But Alex, to what you were talking about earlier, that is like the chip on my shoulder is how many times we've seen people run for office on homelessness or other issues, but they point at it and they don't provide any kind of ideas. And I'd worked behind the scenes in politics for a lot of years, and I left for about a decade. And the reason I left is you'd get people elected into office promising all these things, and then nothing would ever happen, right, as a result of it. And so if you sense a chip on my shoulder a little bit, it's some of that, it's some of the politics of old, and some of the fluff without actually giving concrete answers to stuff. So that's what we're trying to do. We'll probably shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit doing it, but we're committed to doing it.
You'll get in trouble from your opponents for what you say on here.
Fine, bring it on.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I was trying to find the article here, but Multnomah County Commissioner Sharon Myron had made a statement recently that Alex and I were texting about, where she basically said, the city of Portland and Multnomah County just invested a bunch more resources. And she said, I think it's lacking the urgency and the scale that we need, which resonated with me. And so I think as you're exploring and forming policy positions, I think it would be worth talking to. We had someone from the Drug Policy Alliance earlier where we talked about drug legalization. And I'm not suggesting that's the issue here, but Oregon's addiction and recovery community, Oregon Recovers, I think is starting to think in ways that there haven't been a voice at the table representing that constituency previously in Oregon. And I think they're saying some interesting things. So worth checking out. But I do want to transition us to talking about education. That's sort of my wheelhouse as a policy issue. Yeah. But I want to come at it in a bit of a different.
Support me here, Alex. Support me.
Well, actually, I think this might be an easier one because what I want to take out of this is reopening and COVID, because my assumption and hope is
that's the easy one for me.
Exactly. It's too easy. Man. Okay, we can get it out of the way. Mayor, do you support reopening schools?
Absolutely.
Okay, we got it out of the way.
Full time, 5 days a week. Let's do it.
My assumption and my hope is that regardless of who the next governor is, schools are going to be reopened 5 days in person, looking pretty much like it used to look. I do think that there are going to be lingering problems and trauma and learning loss that we're going to be dealing with for many, many years. But I want to ask you, so one thing that I think is interesting, I'll just say that without editorializing, about Oregon is our governor is the superintendent of schools. Yeah. Our governor is the chief instructional officer of the state's public education system. So COVID aside, what is your vision for Oregon's public schools? What do you want to achieve in the realm of education? Jeb Bush famously said he was going to be an education governor of Florida. So I'm curious if you have thoughts broadly on what's working, what's not, and what you would do differently in Oregon's public education system.
Yeah. So, I would just start with saying that the governor should not be superintendent of public schools.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
We have a top-down system here in Oregon for our educational system. I want to see things more ground up, and empowering these local school boards and parents to be able to, talk about the curriculum in their districts and help provide, some more school choice. My kids go to a charter school, public charter school here in the Oregon Trail School District. It's an international baccalaureate, one of these IB schools. So you've got the Mandarin stuff going on there, which is really cool. And I think that's what we need to be seeing here in these different communities, where we get towards a lot more of like a competition-based, skilled-based type education system. Too often, we think that people need to go to college and get a 4-year education. Not everybody needs, quite frankly, to go to college and get a 4-year education. A lot of people do, right? But what we need to do is develop a school system that's more formed, where we can get individual, customized, education opportunities for our kids, and to empower our parents on a local level to help kind of guide people through that process and get more competition and marketplace principles into our schools. Now, I don't believe that's a full voucher system, and I don't necessarily believe that, that's the solution to some of our rural communities, because, okay, great, school choice, and, in my town of, 2 or 3 schools, thank you very much. So we've got to find ways to lift that up. But it goes back to a little bit of my like opt in or opt out. Too often right now here in Oregon is we have state legislators that get elected out of big population centers like Portland and Eugene, who have an unconcentrated level of power in the state. And as a result, they're dictating to people in Central Oregon and Southern Oregon and Eastern Oregon and along the coast what the educational priorities and future for their children to be. And that is not what our country was founded on. Our country was founded on individual liberties and rights, and helping, steer the future of your family how you see fit. And that's where the decisions should, quite frankly, be made. So we'd be looking to make some pretty strong, changes in our education system to really empower local communities with a ground up system instead of top down.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about that too, because if I was running for Oregon governor at some point as a Republican, I would shove the education issue down Democrats' throat repeatedly. I believe, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but Oregon is either last or second to last in the nation for high school graduation rates. And
yeah, but it's it's like the most misleading statistic of all time. It's also harder to graduate from high school here because we have a more rigorous program than in almost any other state. But
yes, that's because we lead the way in test scores. It's so rigorous here in Oregon.
Well, no, like what the requirements of what you need to graduate from high, like in Iowa, it's like 12 credits to graduate. And in here it averages like 24 credits per district. So it's just harder here than in other states.
Gotcha. I still think it's pretty bad.
Yeah, it's a bad statistic for sure.
Yeah, and I've actually always thought, I imagine, and I love Alabama. My father actually lives in Alabama, but to tell Portland liberals like our education system is worse than that in Alabama, I always thought that would be a great talking point.
Seriously, yeah.
For the progressives and the
I mean, if you believe it's true, I think you should believe. I don't believe that's true. But anyway,
I think a lot of the potential classes are probably just credentialing, and people won't really use them necessarily in their jobs anyway. But I mean, just getting into it, it's not even really a like a liberal or conservative issue in the sense of that you have urban schools that have horrible graduation rates. Like some of these schools are basically 1 in 3 kids are graduating. You also have rural schools who have some of these schools, which are just atrocious. They have 1 in 3 kids graduating. To me, that really should sound off alarm bells to everybody that, it doesn't matter if you're red or blue, our schools are just totally failing our students in some way. What do you think are some of those solutions to where we could bridge some of those gaps? And I actually think it's interesting that you say too, like, I think the generic sort of Republican talking point is school choice, as you were saying, but that, of course, if you have a single school in your district, like that doesn't really help you because you don't have any other options. So what do you think that looks like practically? And like are we taking kids out of bad schools and putting them in good schools? Are we providing some sort of subsidy for online education or maybe some extra tutoring or something like that? I'm just really curious of what the sort of response you would give is, because I think that's an issue that, everyone should care about, frankly, and that the Republican Party really hasn't done a good job, not even just in Oregon, but nationally, about talking about education. I do think we have a lot to contribute on the issue too.
Yeah, one is, I think we need to realize that education is twofold a little bit. And, this is going to be kind of a funny line to say, but education is there to educate our children. It's also there as a place for our children to go to receive daycare hours while we have dual working households. And so there's kind of this dual, give and take with it. And what I'll say is I think we should get our kids in the classroom 5 full days a week. And Ben's going, oh no, he's back, getting them back in 5 days a week. We totally try to steer them from this. But we're talking a lot about permanent rules right now. What about 5 full days a week as a permanent rule here in the state? We talk so often about, classroom time and, how often our students are actually getting, educational classroom time. And yet we get all these in-service days and stuff that happen. And, what does that do? It really gives, parents the non-stability that they actually need and crave, because you got dual working, households. At a minimum, parents should be assured the stability of a 5-day school week, both for themselves and for their children to get that additional classroom time. And you think about, teachers need in-service days, they need the ability to prep, but what would the private sector do, right? They would do flex scheduling, they would, combine classes together on a Friday afternoon with one instructor while the other instructor, does their planning, all those kinds of things. I think the other thing is we need new ideas. Coming out of these shutdowns and COVID-19, look at how we're talking right now, right? We're on Zoom, we're doing it virtually, and I'm certainly not about all this hybrid learning and everything that we've seen like it has been over the last year. But I do think there needs to be a recognition that we don't always have to be in the same room all the time, to be able to move the needle and to be able to educate and get things done. I think that there are ways that we need to integrate, technology in the classroom and really reimagine our education system. Because, here's what really bothers me about the statistics that we were all throwing around is you get these numbers to say we're among the best school districts in the state of one of the worst states of education in the country. So now we're one of the worst states in education in the country, and one of the worst countries to get your education in, that is getting.
But do you believe that? You think the United States has one of the worst education systems?
Yeah, you didn't let me finish my sentence. Okay. What I'm saying is when compared to the countries that we need to be competing against, right? When you talk about that, we need to be competing against a vastly growing Chinese, economy, what's going on over in Japan and other nations and stuff right now that, I'm not going to compare us, Ben, to, third world countries and everything else, but you do see other countries that are really investing in their educational systems and really trying to reimagine it. And those are things that we should be doing.
I agree, but I think many of those countries at least are not actually serving all their kids. And if you happen to be in a rural village, you're not going to get a public education. And so their test scores look better than ours because we serve every kid. Sure. And I also know that many of students, when they graduate from their public education systems, come to this country to go to college. So I think the statistics can be misleading. Like I've been thinking a lot about the weaponization of statistics and it's easy.
That's a bipartisan issue, by the way.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But we've got less than 10 minutes left. So I want to ask you another question. It's sort of about what we've been talking about, but it's broader, and it's about the issue of race, which obviously has had a huge spotlight in the national conversation and in the state conversation over the last year. But sort of aside from police reform and public safety, which I think it often talked about in the context of race, but I think the issue is bigger. If you look at economic outcomes, public health outcomes, educational outcomes in this state, in Oregon, people of color have worse outcomes on average than white folks. And in particular, I'm referring to the Latino community, which is a larger population in the state, and also the Black and African-American community. So on the issue of race, I'm sure you've been thinking about this issue like we all have over the last year. As governor, what would you do? What would be your vision or strategies for how we could reduce those disparities as a state, so that outcomes are equitable and that race isn't a predictor for how someone navigates our educational system or our healthcare system? How do you think about that issue?
Yeah, especially after the last year and a half where inequities have really grown as a result of these lockdowns, I mean, not to just keep going back to the lockdowns, but if you're going to be talking about inequities and everything as to whose children is getting educated right now, people who can afford to send their kids to private school, right? Or people who can afford to bring in a tutor into their schools to help their children and stuff who are stuck at home or in this virtual learning. And then you think about the disparities of, who make up the employment groups of these Main Street businesses who have had to shut down, and their access to get their unemployment insurance and stuff over the last year and to be made whole, especially during the holidays. I think our inequities are actually, growing right now as a result of these lockdowns. I'll talk to you about, George Floyd and, and the murder that happened there and how we reacted as a community here. I feel an obligation on it's my hometown. So I feel like I feel everything maybe a lot more. But I felt this, we're second fastest growing city in Oregon. We're an old rural community that's becoming more and more urbanized with, a lot more of diversity coming into town and younger families. And so I really felt an obligation to kind of lead a community dialogue, about, what our conscious and our unconscious biases are, and being what being a welcoming community is all about. But, I got to tell you, under the Trump presidency, a lot of our inequities started to really come together because one tide lifts all boats. And the best way to really help people along is to improve our education system for everyone. One way to get people, more money in their pocket is to improve our local economies and stuff for everyone, to provide tax relief for everyone. And so that's really the way how do I look to lead is I think we spend way too much time, pointing fingers to different special interest groups and categories. And you're a senior, or you're young, or you're a young family, or you're this or that, or what race you are, gender you are. And, we got so many more important issues in talking about what separates us. We're one of the worst educational systems in the country statistically. We've got, crime rates going nuts. We've got riots going on. Our local Main Street economies are going to be struggling for years because of these shutdowns. I mean, that's how we need to face these issues, is face the big issues facing us as a people head on and making sure that we're lifting everybody when we do it.
Well said, Mayor. And great. We just wanted to close it out with one more question. So we know that you're exploring a run for governor and that you have announced an exploratory committee.
Yeah.
What the heck is an exploratory committee? How is that different than actually running for governor?
Pick a team, Mayor. You're in or you're out.
You're either in or you're out. And then what sort of is the decision-making process for you if you're either going to formally announce at some point or if you're going to actually draw out? Like, is there a certain date in mind, or are you trying to meet a fundraising goal? We're just kind of curious to learn, you've made this move. I saw also that you were first place in an Oregon Catalyst poll. So clearly things seem to be going pretty well for you in the primary. So what is an exploratory committee, and when do you think you'd actually come to make a decision?
Well, one, I just like to say we like to be innovators, the first of its kind. I noticed that, we did the exploratory committee, then all of a sudden we got another person that's now formed an exploratory committee, which I think is kind of bad. You lead the way, man. Lead it. These presidential guys, you see exploratory committees on that level all the time. It's really us wanting to be transparent. So we're looking at the governor's race. And what happens is, especially with campaign finance, you start then raising money for that effort, right? You want to do polling. You need to do research on yourself. You got to do, see if you got grassroots support. When you meet with financial or possible financial contributors, you're doing leave behinds for them. And I didn't feel right saying, I'm running for Mayor Sandy and I've got, a couple $100,000 in our pack to do this. The most money ever raised for a Sandy mayor's race is like 10 grand. So that's not being transparent and authentic. And so what I want, but we're also not ready to just say we're in this, right? So you're kind of in this gray area, and the exploratory committee gave me an ability to change what our political action committee was formed for, from mayor to governor, to give people kind of let them in on the joke, what we're doing, and be transparent about that, and then give us some time to really look at it. And so the decision's coming down to, we're a campaign of the people. We're just a couple of middle-class working people, my wife and I, 11,000 population community. There's candidates looking at this race that can write themselves $1 million checks. There's others that are actively courting large corporate special interests. And we're going to need...
Who are some of those candidates?
I know one, but Dr. Bud Pierce, I forgot. He's a very wealthy man who ran for governor before and self-funded. So I forgot that he was in.
He's self-funded as well. And then there's another couple individuals looking at it, but I'm not going to name names till they name themselves into the race, right?
Yeah. Gotcha.
But that's what I'm talking about. We have candidates in this race. This is not scripted at all. I probably shouldn't even say this, but we've got candidates in this race who have campaign staff, who have fired campaign staff, who have leave behinds for people that they're meeting with for potential financial contributors, who have been doing this for months and have not declared anything in their political action committee. And so when you talk about like, why am I doing this, right? I'm doing this because we're wanting to be transparent and authentic with people, and you see a lot of people that are not doing that. And it really goes against the rules of transparency and everything that our election system is supposed to be about, quite frankly. But back to that, we got the Oregon Moms Union that McKinsey formed. They're going to have a district mom in every school district across the state. We're working with Main Street mayors to get mayors involved in all these local communities. We're going to have county chairs. We're looking to just build out. We're on this listening tour that's taking us all over the state. We have over 450 individual contributors who've already contributed. And the average contributions between $50 and $70. We're over 130,000 raised, just in this first couple of months. And so that's what the decision-making process is about, is what kind of support are we going to have out there? And we're looking at, midsummer to make that final decision to jump in. So,
well, I appreciate your transparency, and I look forward to your competitors paying a fine from the Secretary of State's office as a Democrat.
I was going to say for all of our press friends who are listening, it sounds like you have some work to do.
The bad news is no one's listening to the last minute of the episode. We lost everybody long ago. But well, Mr. Mayor, thank you for making time to join the podcast and for sparring with us and answering some questions. Our last thing is, where should people go to follow you if they're interested in your campaign and they want to learn more? How can they be in touch?
Yep, stanpulliam.org. It's Mayor Stan for Oregon on our social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And I just want to say, thank you for having me on here, Ben. It was so fun going back and forth on some of these issues, and that you guys, this is what we're supposed to be doing, right, as a country. And this is the kind of leads us out of this partisan divide we have right now, is challenge each other and have these conversations. And, Ben, I just met for the first time. You seem like a great guy. Alex, we know, is a great guy. Just right now, but
very good guy.
That's right. The good people is not partisan. It's not party specific, and we need to be able to have more conversations like this. So I really appreciate you having me on today.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and share this pod with your friends. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.